Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth.
Mr. Speaker, I want to welcome the people back to the people's house. I want to welcome democracy back to the people's house. That on last Thursday, members of this body tried to crucify democracy, but today we stand as a witness of a resurrection of a movement of a multiracial democracy that no unjust decision will stand.
So much deception, so much deception. Now, you need to be honest with yourself about when something is grassroots or astroturf. It can save your life. For 15 years now, we in the black media have taught you that when you see the white media talking about a black person and they're not attacking them, when you see the white media heaping tons of praise on some Negro you never heard of and who you don't know, that's because they're trying to invent a new front man to mislead you and me. This is what happened with D. Ray McKesson, you'll recall. This guy, who might as well have dropped down from Mars, was suddenly on TV, on CNN no less. The white media suddenly giving him a platform. He's on talk shows in university campuses. All of this instant credibility trying to credentialize this guy. And why? They were trying to make him a thing. He didn't just pop up out of nowhere. He was selected by white power as their latest trial balloon to see if they can get some traction and establish himself as a leader among black people. And that brings us back to the most recent developments out of Tennessee, talking about the so-called Tennessee Three. The white media is still calling them that. Now, the white woman wasn't expelled, so why is it still three? So as far as I'm concerned, they're the Tennessee Two, one of which has already been reinstated, by the way. So that long winter of injustice apparently came to an end pretty quick, right? At least to hear Justin Jones tell the story. You can expect the white media to go overboard trying to make false comparisons between these guys and Dr. King. Not because the white media loves these two, the white media could care less about them, but because they want you to like them. They want you to look up to them. They want you to make a false association in your mind between these two and Dr. King. But something that I noticed over the weekend as the white media was going breathless about this story, those white female activists who MSNBC had on near nonstop, they didn't have a word of gratitude for these two so-called political martyrs. Oh no, it seemed these white female activists, they were not grateful at all for these two young black men standing in solidarity with them and, quote-unquote, sacrificing their political careers for them.
Your thoughts on these two lawmakers being expelled for protesting gun violence? What does this say to you about democracy in your state?
I think it says something that we've known for a long time, which is that the lawmakers are scared of the power of the youth vote. So these people have shown up and stood with us and are being punished for standing with these youth voices. And not only did we organize last week, we've had almost 11 days of continuous action at the Capitol. And we actually sat in for 12 hours during their expulsion because these lawmakers have tried to silence us so thoroughly, and we won't stand for that.
All these two white female activists cared about was their issue. Race didn't even come out of their mouths. They didn't care about that at all. It was all about what they wanted and how they weren't being heard and how important their interests are. This is using black people as crash dummies. Not those two legislators. They were merely political actors playing their parts. I'm talking about the black public who's being manipulated into supporting what's going on there without actually paying attention to what they're supporting. Make no mistake, these white female protesters that you saw, they're going to be the real winners when all of this is over. I wouldn't be surprised at all to see them move on to bigger and better things, courtesy of the DNC. There's also another thing you better look out for. The white media makes it their mission to try to choose our leaders for us. So they get some bought and paid for shill sellout, some clown who shares their values and is pushing their agenda, and then they put him on TV and say that they're a black leader. Malcolm X warned us about this. He talked about this all the way back in the 60s, how the white media would invent black leaders out of whole cloth. They've been trying and failing for going on 10 years now to counter the growing influence of the new voices of black media. The white media has been trying to raise up their own bumper crop of hand-picked puppets who they would try to use to co-opt the movement that we represent. People you never heard of. And when you ask what issues they're representing, they talk about gender fluidity, feminism, and trans rights. None of those things have anything to do with black people's issues. George Floyd wasn't heinously murdered because of feminism, gender anything, or trans rights. He was murdered only because he was black. And the same goes for Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Oscar Grant, Breonna Taylor, Philandro Castile, and I'll be here till 3 in the morning naming just a few of them. The white Democratic establishment talking points that these black mouthpieces keep pushing are irrelevant to the oppression that we face, because ours is based on race, not what we do in the bedroom. So why do these alleged black speakers never speak on what actually affects black people? Because the goal is to make sure there is never a discussion that is centered on black people. Because whenever the discussion is, it changes things. Yes, the expulsion of those 2 representatives was based on race, that's true. But the individuals who got expelled were talking about patriarchy and trans rights and that empty class struggle talk. Didn't that strike you as just a little bit strange? You have these 2 previously unknown individuals who take part in disrupting the state legislative session over, they claimed, gun control, and they say in passing they were expelled because of their race, but when they get a chance to speak in public, on camera, in the white media, they talk about everything except race. This is meant to craft a message that makes it where the listener can project onto them whatever you want. If you're black, you're encouraged to project onto them that this is about race. But if you're, say, a white suburban woman, you can go ahead and project onto them that this is about gun control, patriarchy, feminism, and trans rights. That's what 90% of what they said was about. They were doing everything they could to give this mamby-pamby, empty, innocuous fluff where they weren't really saying very much at all. This little incident down in Tennessee looks exactly like what it is, a Democratic get-out-the-vote effort. This was their youth outreach program for the 2024 season. Well, Justin Jones was reinstated yesterday, and he says now that democracy has been returned to the State House.
I want to welcome democracy back to the people's house.
Well, I'll tell Justin Jones the same thing that I told his colleague Heidi Campbell last week when she said that democracy died in Tennessee that day. Tell me, Justin Jones, when has there ever been democracy in Tennessee? Was everything fine up until last week? No problems with democracy in Tennessee until last week, huh? How can you say democracy has returned to Tennessee's state legislature when it was never there to begin with, and still isn't there now? Apparently, Justin Jones seems to think that democracy means his job. Sounds like Barack Obama, don't it? Sounds like every black GOP mouthpiece you ever heard, doesn't it? The white media is pulling a deception. They distract you by pointing to the overtly racist white legislators in Tennessee and then to the color of the representatives who they expelled without ever actually looking at what those representatives were taking a stand for. They weren't taking a stand for anything relating to black people being killed by the thugs in blue. The very tragedy that allegedly prompted their protest last week wasn't even because black people had been slaughtered en masse. One black man had been killed, but mostly it happened to be about white students at a private school and their teachers. And that's why the white media was able to get behind it. If these had been black people who had been killed, like, say, in Buffalo, these guys could have set fire to the state legislature. The white media would have been saying, well, they should have been expelled. They could have been disruptive, and that wouldn't have mattered. The white media would have moved on to something else. See, when the Democrats' other constituents are being threatened or mistreated by GOP policy or what have you, the Democrats actually do something about that. States want to ban abortion. Democrats organize statewide referendums to defeat those efforts. Clarence Thomas hints that reversing gay marriage is on his agenda. The Democrats didn't wait to see if the conservative court was going to do it. They took preemptive action and passed a gay marriage law, and they claimed that they were doing it for black people too. Have you ever seen the Democrats piggyback legislation to benefit black people on the back of some other essential legislation? They don't do that for us. All we hear is there's nothing they can do on anything, but we better vote for them because of all the things they've done. White supremacy is the law of the land, and that law is not based on sexism, homophobia, or anti-gender fluidity. Look at the Constitution of the United States, and you won't find a single word about feminism, homosexuality, or trans anything, though you will find that black people are declared 3/5 human beings. You will find that in the Constitution. So, as you can tell by the visuals on your screen, I give that as a preface to the fact that you can judge people by the company they keep. Whenever something is presented to you by the white media, you're supposed to be suspicious. The white media has been a nonstop tool of anti-black propaganda for hundreds of years now, and the white media is quite sophisticated. I know there's some hardheads out there who like to deny it because it makes them feel better, but you can't change reality by denying reality. You have to face it. And in the real world, the white media is very crafty and very clever with their propaganda. They have to be. They specialize in giving instant credibility to their tools. Those two Tennessee legislators weren't making my heart go pitter-pat because I actually listened to what they said, and they sounded like every DNC liberal I'd ever heard. They talked about LGBT rights and patriarchy and class division, but nothing about black people. They only gave fleeting, insincere lip service to white supremacy, but that was about it. Most of their support came from white women that I saw. That's who I saw as the majority of the protesters marching in the streets and who had also disrupted the Tennessee legislature. That's who I saw. And Jones and Pearson made it a point to speak to their issues. And to camouflage that, the white media spent a lot of time talking about, well, these guys are black. Normally, wouldn't the white media be saying that there are allegations that this was racial? Isn't that what the white media normally does whenever you have a black person who's saying that they've been discriminated against because of race? Wouldn't the white media normally be saying, well, there's accusations and allegations and, well, we can't be sure and we can't know what's in the legislators' hearts? Why? How much do we know about the Tennessee legislature? Normally, they would be putting nothing but question marks on all this. They wouldn't be making any definitive declaratory statements, but they were in this case. So what does that tell you? The goal here is to forward this bit of political theater to get you to think that you should follow these two. But as the black media, we've always taught you to never let the white media tell you who to follow. And if they're endorsing someone, that's your first clue that there's nothing good in it for you. If these guys actually were a threat to white supremacy, if they actually were about forward and promoting anything of benefit to black people, the white media would either be ignoring them or attacking them. Now, when I saw those two using that bullhorn, you know what it reminded me of? Al Sharpton back in the day. He became famous for running around with a bullhorn shouting about this and that, and now he's on NBC squawking about nothing. So for the last few days, we've been seeing what is clearly a political operation by the DNC going on here. You had two legislators in Tennessee who took part in a protest inside the legislative chamber, and one white member who kind of just stood there, and the local Klansmen got their pointy heads bent out of joint and predictably did some overreaction because everybody knows the GOP today is all about performative extremism. It was very easy to game this one out and predict what the good old boys in Tennessee would do. They've been following DeSantis' example of trying to be as overtly fascist as possible. So when someone opposes them, you can take out your watch and count the seconds before they try to retaliate through the legislature with some over-the-top display of aggression and angst, because that's what they do. Going nuclear is the standard operating procedure for the GOP today. Soon as I heard that these two could be reinstated by their respective city councils, I knew that this was all just theater. And when I heard what all they were saying, I understood that they were irrelevant to black empowerment. As the black media, we teach you to judge people by the company they keep. When some new face is introduced to you by the white media, they're immediately suspect. Consider the source. And another thing you're supposed to do is to check people's paperwork. Brother Tariq did an excellent background check on Justin Jones just the other night, and over the weekend, more of Jones and Pearson's paperwork has come back dirty. Kamala Harris is literally being embraced by these two, and we're also seeing other people who no legitimate figure of black empowerment would be caught dead with. Every so often, the white media treats us to, rather subjects us to, another sighting of Big Bird. Now, for those of you who don't know, from time to time you've probably heard me refer to an unnamed person as Big Bird. That person is Mark Thompson. He's supposed to be the leader of a group calling itself NCOBRA, an alleged reparations group that hasn't done a dang thing to get us reparations. The reason I call him Big Bird is because he went on Joke Reed's show years back, and he was wearing this big yellow outfit. Looked like he was wearing his mama's kitchen tablecloth, and that was the interview where he began babbling about some do-nothing function that his organization had held, and they have had some sort of vote at their so-called luncheon. Now, like a lot of you, I've noticed over the decades that whenever these black baby boomers get on TV, I'm talking about these civil rights retreads in specific, they always talk about some prayer breakfast they had, or some luncheon, or some dinner, or whatever, and whenever they have one of these meals, they would claim that they had some sort of vote. I guess that's supposed to make it seem as if they were doing something important there. I've heard this kind of spiel from these clowns whenever they were on TV or radio, and I'm sure most of you can recall these dinosaurs telling some sort of similar tale, because this is about the only accomplishment they can talk about. To them, this is getting something done. That's supposed to be a win in their eyes, or rather they want you to think that it is. Gee, let's go down to the Western Sizzlin' then, and we'll go ahead and ask some people, yay or nay, who's in favor of reparations. Well, the people who aren't stuffing their faces with barbecue, they'll probably lift up a hand that's caked in barbecue sauce and say, me. Well, then, okay, after you take your vote, then what happens? We go back to eating. I guess giving away a free lunch is the only way that these dusty, musty, shiftless good-for-nothings can get people to show up for anything. So for the few people who are probably wondering where phrases like Big Bird and my references to the NAACP Spring Breakfast and the Urban League Summer Luncheon and the National Action League Fall Fish Fry came from, now you know. And as if to make it any clearer that this was all just some political AstroTurf operation, Big Bird was there front and center. He was right with them when those two were expelled last week. And promptly Joy Reid had him on her little sideshow, where naturally he tried to make it all about himself. And then, on cue, he was right back out there in Nashville yesterday when Jones was reinstated by the Nashville City Council. You know, I couldn't help but think of Gil Scott-Heron's classic, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." He said it 50 years ago, and it's still true today.
There will be no pictures of Whitney Young being run out of Harlem on a rail with a brand new process. There will be no slow motion or still life of Roy Wilkins strolling through Watts in a red, black, and green liberation jumpsuit that he has been saving for just the proper occasion.
There will be no pictures of Al Sharpton being run out of Harlem on a rail with a brand new process. There will be no slow motion or still life of Mark Thompson strolling through Nashville in a red, black, and green tablecloth that he's been saving for just the proper occasion. See, they had Negro puppets of white power putting on political theater back then, too. The lyrics are still relevant because our condition hasn't changed, and the con men who white power uses to confuse our internal politics hasn't changed either. I mean, for God's sake, the presence of Big Bird was the biggest giveaway in all this. This guy pals around with the likes of Kamala Harris, and when he interviewed her before the 2020 election, he refused to press her on reparations at all. This was after she had said that she wasn't going to do anything that only benefited black people. He sees himself as nothing more than a socialite. We don't need sellout shills for the DNC calling themselves speaking for us. Now, do you think this guy is somehow out here to help us? Only one he's trying to help is himself, same as Pearson and Jones, and you need to hear that. This was a very sophisticated bit of political theater that got put on. It wasn't sophisticated in its form, but it was definitely sophisticated in its intent. Have their shills go into a den of vipers like the Tennessee legislature, which we can all agree is a racist sewer. Have them then be intentionally disruptive, and then wait for the unreasonable racist to predictably do something unreasonably racist. It ain't rocket science, folks, especially not in this political climate. The enemy of my enemy ain't necessarily my friend. When the white supremacists from the U.S. were fighting the white supremacists in Germany in the Second World War, which one of them was our friend? See how that works? A lot of people got suckered into supporting those shills because of what the white media was saying about them. And when it comes to people like Big Bird, there have been others who really ought to know better who decided they were going to speak up for him. No less than the final call was out there 4 years ago, back when the A-Dunce movement was in its death throes. Its 15 minutes of fame were up. But Big Bird had gone on Joy Reid's show and saying anyone who demands reparations but only holds Democrats accountable aren't genuine representatives of the movement. Well, first of all, nobody's talking about only holding Democrats accountable. Republicans have made it clear they don't want the black vote. So that being the case, if the Democrats are going to purport to be the black people's only option, we have a right to demand something of that option. In the beginning of this piece, the Final Call's writer wrote that those who have been engaged in reparations on the ground at the grassroots level, they were talking about Big Bird, have been increasingly skeptical of blah, blah, blah. Squarejaw and Mushmouth were the ones being mentioned, but they were not the ones who Big Bird was taking aim at when he went on Joke Reid's show. Now, before I go any further, I need to say this. I'm well aware that the people who listen to me come from a variety of different backgrounds. Some of you are political, some of you are in finance, but a lot of you come from a religious background of some sort or another, be it Baptist, Hebrew, Israelite, Muslim, what have you. We all come from somewhere different. But it's our understanding of the racial reality we live in that's supposed to bind us, and that's supposed to cross all economic, political, lifestyle, and religious lines. The core identity of black empowerment and the code of conduct it represents are supposed to be the tie that binds us together. That's what brought you here and keeps you here. That's why you listen to voices like mine. That's why I don't run around pushing any sort of political party or religious affiliation either. Let's all agree that the foundation of our interactions with one another is supposed to be based on the essential philosophy of be one. If your religion is important to you, fine, but it better not blind you to the fact that this world isn't governed by whatever good book you read. If it was, you wouldn't be oppressed. And many of the people who oppress you use the same book that you do and claim to pray to the same God, and then they turn right around and attack and even kill you, not based on your religion, but based on the color of your skin. And the saddest part is that whether the attack comes from a religious, economic, or political source, you always got a number of black people who have been helping the enemy carry out the attacks. I want you to keep that in mind before you go having a knee-jerk reaction over what I'm going to say next. Now, this article from The Final Call starts off by talking about people being sensitive and swarming, quote, at the slightest hint of feeling disrespected in any way. This is how The Final Call characterizes people who take issue with these professional do-nothings like Big Bird. Swarming is a word to describe the behavior of insects. The Nation of Islam's members, especially its leaders and those who handle its communications, don't make comparisons like that lightly. Remember, a core tenet of the Nation of Islam is that they don't use profanity. So when they compare someone to an insect or an animal, that has a lot more gravity and importance than someone who's used to using 4- and 5-letter words as their ultimate form of disrespect. I want those of you who are Muslims to keep in mind that Khalid Muhammad was demanding reparations a lot more than more visible members of the nation had. I know a lot of you who listen to me are practicing Muslims, and I don't call into question your integrity, but you better understand that when a publication is promoting and defending a man who's done nothing for us, that tells you a lot. Because without any sort of examination or criticism, they just mindlessly repeat Big Bird's claim that anyone who puts pressure on the Democrats about reparations aren't genuine representatives of the movement. Now, this guy doesn't criticize the Democrats for doing nothing to get us our reparations. Big Bird has no criticism for the Democrats for that or for anything. He's just a Democratic Party cheerleader. He just wants black people to vote for nothing. He's not about black empowerment. He's not about black people being heard. He's about being a phony, dashiki-wearing black radical cosplayer. Because that's what he is. He wears some colorful outfit and then tells us not to put pressure on anyone for our reparations or for really anything that we want. So when does Big Bird think we ought to withhold our vote then? When does he think we ought to leverage our vote to get what we need? Because a vote is the only leverage that the impoverished have. That is, other than physical means. It's the only way we can deprive the would-be political class of the positions of power that they crave. But he says don't use it. This is who's been calling themselves speaking for you and me for generations now. And you wonder why it is the white media puts these guys on the air. Because what they say is conducive and expedient to the interests of white supremacy. And look who it is who's taking his side. We have these groups who have done absolutely nothing for reparations. They've been around for decades and decades, if not a century. They haven't even made reparations into a topic of conversation for even one election cycle. Groups like the Nation of Islam and N-Cobra claim to be the grassroots. Well, what's grown from these grassroots in the last 100 years? What has the nation done with all its money and organization to move the needle for reparations? There was a march in Washington 25 years ago, and that was followed by... And as for N-Cobra, what have they done for reparations in the last 30 or 40 years, or however many years they claim to have been around? Big Bird said that they were the oldest reparations organization in America. Okay, and after all these decades, what do they have to show for it? They've got a spring breakfast, a summer luncheon, a fall fish fry, and a fireside chat with Kamala Harris. That's it. And if there's anyone who's feeling some kind of way about me expressing that, then what you're really saying is don't demand anything of the Democrats, and don't also ask anything of the people who are defending inaction in the face of all of this political benign neglect. When The Final Call chooses to endorse this guy and defend him and give him a platform and disparage criticism of him, that tells me a lot about The Final Call. Now, this may not necessarily represent the end-all and be-all of that particular publication, but my question is, why was it there at all? And before I forget, here's a picture of Joy Reid, Simone Sanders, and Big Bird at some convention where a bunch of leftists and such sit around talking about nothing. Shills of a feather fail together. Big Bird plays the game of getting on the white media's TV channels because that's how he eats, no pun intended. All of this was the white media's latest effort to prop up some hand-picked shills who we're supposed to get behind, and they're going to speak for us, and their message will be nothing about reparations, nothing about black people. Instead, it's going to be all about the interest of every other constituency except Us. So once again, family, we have to remember the rules. If somebody pops up out of nowhere and here they are talking kinda like us, if you don't know them, don't trust them. If the white media is praising this person, that's because they're on the take. And always check their paperwork. We don't let the white media manipulate us with sound and images. This isn't the 60s. We're not starved for images of black people leading crowds of protesters. What we are starved for is the monetary wealth that our and our ancestors' labor generates and that has been wrongfully withheld from us. And all the breakfasts and luncheons and fish fries from N-Cobra and the rest of their ilk have left us nothing but hungry. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Jacques Hargett, Damian Bryson, Elaine Zanga, Eve, and Kenneth Prescia. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.